Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, life through a lens, what the African media are saying about Robert Mugabe.
And as Mugabe extended his 28-year rule, the condemnation of happenings in Zimbabwe continued.
Sarkozy, the French president, dictates the future of public TV in France.
Sarkozy does not have the money to buy the television networks, therefore he has just taken them over.
The award-winning Palestinian journalist who accuses the Israelis of putting him in the hospital. And the musical form they call the fifth element of hip-hop, beatbox on the net. Welcome back. If photo opportunities were all you had to go on, you'd have said it's been a good week for the Zimbabwean president, Robert Mugabe. Addressing cheering crowds, voting in an election in which he was the only candidate, taking his presidential oath for the 6th time in 31 years before jetting off to the African Union summit in Egypt. With the domestic media under the control of Mugabe's ZANU-PF party, that's the picture that Zimbabweans get every day. But how are the media outside of Zimbabwe explaining the events behind the photo ops, the sham election, the empty victory at the polls? That's our starting point this week. The media, Mugabe, and what's in store for Zimbabwe.
Sir, Julian Mannion about here.
Post-colonial media moments at the Africa Union Summit in Egypt. President Robert Mugabe confronted by reporters from Britain, the former colonial power in what is now Zimbabwe.
May I just ask you one question, sir? On what basis do you now regard yourself as president of Zimbabwe?
What have the British to do with Zimbabwe? Who are you? You bloody idiots!
Mr. Mugabe, congratulations on stealing the election.
No.
Do you feel, Mr. Mugabe?
The trouble with electing yourself president and then attending a big international summit is that you can't control the press like you can back home.
These are the kinds of public altercations Robert Mugabe seldom has to worry about from the Zimbabwean media.
Some independent media is tolerated in Zimbabwe, provided there is not too much of it. So you have several independent weekly newspapers, but when the Daily News, which was the most popular opposition newspaper in Zimbabwe, launched a daily edition in place of its original weekly edition, then fairly soon it became too critical and it was put out of business, and its presses, printing presses, were blown up.
That leaves a few weekly papers that are critical of the Mugabe government. However, their circulation and influence are both limited.
The independent media, the weeklies, have been strident in their criticism of Mugabe. They've made it quite clear that the runoff election was a travesty of democracy. It is doubtful whether they serve a readership beyond 100,000, and this is mostly within Harare and the metropolitan areas. The election in a country like Zimbabwe, with more than 60% of its population in the countryside, is lost and won in the rural areas, and newspapers hold no sway, in that context.
In most African countries, the government believes that it has a right to own the entire press. In our region, South Africa remains the only one that doesn't have newspapers owned by the government. Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, and Angola, most of them insist that the major media should be owned by the government, which I think has been the case of the region.
In Zimbabwe, covering opposition figures such as Morgan Tsvangirai can be a dangerous business.
One journalist who took footage of Tsvangirai after he was bashed last year was actually murdered. That, of course, struck fear in the hearts of many of the journalists, young ones especially. People have been killed.
The Mugabe government has state-run TV in Zimbabwe under its firm control and uses it to air election ads like this one, which depicted Morgan Tsvangirai as the American president and British Prime Minister in disguise. Playing the post-colonial card, characterizing foreign critics as neo-colonials, plays well with some Zimbabwean voters.
It's those in number 10 Downing Street. The demons in number 10 Downing Street must be exorcised by someone.
However, more and more of Mugabe's critics in the foreign media are in fact African.
And as Mugabe extended his 28-year rule, the condemnation of happenings in Zimbabwe continued.
Certainly in the African media you will come across more voices expressing support for ZANU-PF and the regime, but you'll also find very many critics. Certainly a deeper and a more sincere fascination with what has happened to the liberation movement over the course of 28 years.
Kenya, for instance, has been very critical. Tanzania as well, I think there's no doubt about that. And I think that Angola, as we mentioned, Botswana, of course. You know, I think that the newspapers in those countries and even the media have said those elections were not free and fair. Even the 29 March ones were not free and fair because the violence. It's only when you talk of Somalia and countries like Ethiopia and so on, where you find that they take a very, very pro-Mugabe position. But I think, in general, the African press has not been kind to Mugabe.
There is a sense of Pan-Africanist pride in most African media. Most governments would say, of course, the independently owned press is unpatriotic and it is neoliberal in its ideological approach. That's the accusation that the Zimbabwe government has leveled against the South African press so often, in response to criticism from South Africa. They have called it the apartheid press, so to speak.
I would suggest that in the African media there is less of a tendency towards wanting a sense of historical vindication, which you do find quite a lot of, particularly in the British press, which isn't in any way to demean or excuse the atrocities that have happened in Zimbabwe, but certainly the moral compass is slightly different.
The Zimbabwe story is more complicated than it looks. The media's clear consensus is that Robert Mugabe stole the election. However, there is a wider context to this story and how it is reported. The country's colonial baggage, its past relationship with Great Britain, and how Mugabe compares with other African leaders, although not all journalists agree that any of that really matters.
Some African journalists tend to say the emphasis on Zimbabwe is uncalled for because there are other situations which are just as bad. There are other leaders who are just as bad. Why don't you concentrate on them, and leave Mugabe alone? But why? I mean, I say I'm a Zimbabwean, and why should we leave Mugabe alone? I mean, the country is gone to the dogs. Why should we say it's okay? It's not okay. We should criticize him.
Our Global Village Voices now on Reporting Zimbabwe.
There's a terrible kind of push to report victims, always victims. And what we're not seeing is the really huge pockets of resistance that there are in Zimbabwe. Don't report if you don't really understand the issues, because in Zimbabwe now, those issues are life and death.
I think broadly, the Zimbabwe question has not been, objectively been approached by both African media and Western media. There has been a subjective approach from Africans being supporting, the Harare regime. And also there has been a subjective approach by the Western media as, aimed at exposing the Mugabe regime only, but not, trying to expose their negative approach.
Our Global Village Voice platform offers anybody the chance to weigh in with their opinion on the state of the world's media. Email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net and we'll find a way to get your voice on the air. It's time now for some quick hits on the media. Listening Post News Bites. Germany, which has the largest Turkish population in Europe outside of Turkey, has outlawed Kurdish television channel Roj TV. The channel is accused by Turkey of having links to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which both Turkey and the European Union consider to be a terrorist organization. Turkey also wants the EU to ban the channel, which is broadcast from Denmark. The PKK has fought a 2-decade-long war for Kurdish autonomy in southeastern Turkey at the cost of almost 40,000 lives. The Kenyan government has threatened to suspend the license of a local radio station for broadcasting what it calls inflammatory content. The government says Cass FM, which broadcasts in the Kalenjin language, was airing material that was a threat to national security. The charges relate to phone-in programs discussing recent election-related violence. The station has denied the charges. Earlier this year, the government threatened to revoke the licenses of many other stations, accusing them of inciting violence during the post-election chaos, which left at least 1,500 Kenyans dead. A UK broadcaster has paid a ransom of around $300,000 to secure the release of a documentary filmmaker who was held hostage in Pakistan after trying to make contact with Al-Qaeda's second-in-command. Sean Langan was held for 3 months near the Pakistan-Afghan border by criminals linked to the Taliban. His kidnappers threatened to shoot the journalist and his interpreter if the ransom was not paid. The two men, who were working for Channel 4's Dispatches program, were reportedly released after an Afghan go-between hired by the broadcaster delivered a briefcase full of cash to their captors.
Keep a low profile, but managed to meet some of these people, the Taliban.
The British Foreign Office is reported to have warned Channel 4 against paying any money, fearing that it could inspire copycat abductions of journalists. Israel has denied allegations by an award-winning Palestinian journalist that he was abused and injured by Israeli security personnel while on his way home to the Gaza Strip. Mohammed Omer, who was returning to Gaza after receiving a journalism award in Britain, said that he was held for nearly 4 hours at an Israeli-controlled bridge. The reporter said he was forced to strip down to his underwear and was physically abused. He was later admitted to hospital, where he was said to have suffered several broken ribs. An Israeli official said that Omar received, quote, fair treatment and no irregular action was taken towards him, unquote, during the search. Omar had just received the Martha Gellhorn Prize at a ceremony in London awarded to journalists who expose establishment propaganda.
There was a hit piece by somebody in the New York Times.
The Fox News Channel's morning show took a run at the New York Times last week over a story the Times ran on ratings troubles at Fox.
That's why he sends his attack dog, Jacques Steinberg, out, that fellow right there, the writer for the New York Times, to do these hit pieces.
However, the pictures that Fox used showing the Times writer and his editor had been digitally altered and compared to the originals were most unflattering. Fox did not disclose it had doctored the images. A Times editor called Fox's photo work disgusting and beneath contempt. We're back after the break with a story on French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who can't keep his hands off the media.